Hello everyone, today I would like to tell a true story about when a fire destroys his home and everything he owns, a man discovers the true meaning of gratitude in the faces of those who help him rebuild.
It was a cold December night, the kind of night when the world feels still, when the only sound is the soft hum of distant traffic and the steady rhythm of your own breathing. And in a small, quiet house at the edge of town, Elias sat by the window, unaware that this would be the last peaceful moment he would know for a long time. Just hours earlier, he had been lost in his thoughts, thinking about bills, unfinished dreams, and the usual questions that weigh on a man who feels life slipping faster than he can hold it. He wasn't happy, but he told himself he was fine. Fine enough to get through the day, fine enough to ignore the emptiness settling inside him. Then came the smell, faint at first, a burning scent like dust on old wires. Elias stood up, confused. He turned toward the kitchen and froze. A glow, a breath of heat, then a sudden roar. Flames burst upward, swallowing the curtains, crawling across the cabinets like they had been waiting for this moment. He shouted, stumbling backward. The air thickened, turning heavy, poisonous. The fire spread mercilessly as if it had been born angry. He tried to grab a photo album, tried to reach the old box of letters his mother once wrote him, but the flames moved faster. "Get out!" It was all his mind could scream. He ran through thick smoke, coughing, eyes burning. For a moment he thought he wouldn't make it. The doorway blurred, the floor beneath him groaned. The house, his house, was collapsing. When he finally burst outside, gasping, he turned back and saw everything he owned. Everything he once complained about, everything he took for granted, turning into ash. Neighbors gathered. Someone called the fire department. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Someone whispered, "I'm so sorry." But Elias didn't hear much. His ears filled with the crackling of wood, the collapse of memories, the sound of a life burning away. And in that moment, standing barefoot in the cold, he felt something he couldn't put into words. Not just fear, not just shock, but the heavy, crushing realization of how fragile everything truly was. His home, his belongings, the pieces of his past, gone in one night. He sank to his knees, tears mixing with the falling embers, and for the first time in years, he whispered a trembling question into the night. "What do I have left?" The fire didn't answer, but someone else would, soon. Elias stayed on the ground longer than he expected, staring at the place where his life used to stand. But then, a hand touched his shoulder. Hey, look at me. You're safe." He lifted his eyes and saw Mara, his next-door neighbor, a woman he had spoken to only a handful of times. He never knew much about her, never had a real conversation. Yet here she was, kneeling beside him in the freezing night, her breath visible in the smoky air, her eyes filled with concern. She draped her own coat over his shoulders without hesitation. He hadn't even realized he was shivering. The firefighters arrived in a storm of flashing lights and shouting commands, but their voices felt distant. Mara stayed close, grounding him, letting him lean on someone when he wasn't strong enough to stand on his own. And slowly, neighbors began to gather. People he barely spoke to. People he assumed were too busy, too distant, too wrapped in their own lives to even notice him. Yet they were there, stepping out into the cold with blankets, water, even just presence. No judgment, no questions about what he should have done differently. Only human beings doing what humans are supposed to do. Help one another stand when life knocks them flat. As the flames died down, a weary fire captain approached. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "There's nothing left to salvage." The words hit Elias like another blow. He lowered his head, feeling the weight of everything collapsing again. The past, the memories, the small comforts that once filled the corners of his days. But then Mara spoke gently. "You're alive, Elias. You survived. That means something. And you're not alone, not tonight." He looked at her, really looked at her, at the sincerity in her voice, at the way her hands didn't hesitate to steady him. at the circle of neighbors who stayed even after the fire was contained, offering warmth in the cold that had nothing to do with blankets. Something shifted inside him, just a little, a faint crack in the numbness. He didn't understand it yet, but a seed was planted in that moment, a quiet truth beginning to form beneath the ruins. Sometimes, what burns away is not just loss. Sometimes, fire clears space for something you were too blind to notice before. But Elias wouldn't see that clearly until later. For now, all he felt was the ache, the confusion, the strange, overwhelming gratitude that people he barely knew were holding him up when he couldn't do it himself. He whispered, voice trembling, Why are you all doing this for me?" Mara answered softly, almost as if speaking to a friend she'd always known. "Because no one rebuilds alone. Not really. And tonight, you need us." And for the first time since the fire began, Elias felt something steady inside him. Not hope, not yet, but the beginning of it, the faintest spark. By dawn, the fire trucks were gone. The flashing lights faded, the crowd dispersed, and the street returned to its quiet winter stillness. But Elias remained awake, sitting in Mara's living room, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, staring at the cup of warm tea she'd placed gently into his trembling hands. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames swallowing the life he once knew. The house he complained about, the furniture he thought was outdated, the memories he hadn't appreciated. All gone. Mara didn't speak unless he did. She simply stayed nearby, giving him space but not letting him fall completely into the darkness that hovered over him. "You should try to rest," she said softly. He shook his head. I don't even know where to begin." It wasn't just the house. It was the idea of starting from nothing again, of having every familiar certainty ripped away in a single night. When the sun finally rose, Elias stepped outside. Cold air hit his face like a sharp reminder that the world was still turning, even if he felt stuck. He walked toward the charred remains of his home, the place where he cooked meals while thinking life was too ordinary, the place where he slept without realizing how lucky he was to have a roof above him, the place he never imagined losing, until it vanished. The structure was unrecognizable. Blackened wood, broken glass, ash floating in the quiet morning light like fragile snowflakes. He crouched down, brushing soot from what once was his living room floor. His fingers shook, his chest tightened, and suddenly the grief hit him all at once. A raw, overwhelming wave that took his breath away. He sank to the ground, hands pressed against the cold earth, whispering through a cracked voice, "I don't know how to start over." A moment later, footsteps approached softly behind him. It was Daniel, a man from down the street whom Elias had barely spoken to in the entire 5 years he lived there. Daniel placed a bag beside him. "I thought you might need some basics," he said simply. "Toothbrush, clothes, essentials, nothing fancy." We all chipped in. Elias's eyes widened. "We? Who's we?" Daniel pointed to the sidewalk. There they were, a group of neighbors standing quietly, waiting to help. Some brought tools, some brought food, some simply brought presents. He had never noticed them this deeply. He had lived beside these people for years, keeping to himself, assuming everyone was living their own isolated life. But today, they stood with him. Mara walked up beside him and placed a hand on his arm. "Elias, look around," she whispered. "You didn't lose everything." He swallowed hard. The weight of those words pressed deep. No, he hadn't lost everything. He had lost the walls, the objects, the things he once believed defined his stability. But what stood in front of him now, human hands, human hearts, human kindness, felt like something he had never truly appreciated until the fire forced him to. A morning that should have been filled with despair was instead filled with people who refused to let him face it alone. And in the quiet between their footsteps and the winter breeze, a fragile thought formed inside him. What if this tragedy wasn't just an ending, but the beginning of something he never realized he needed? Not rebuilding a house, but rebuilding himself. And gratitude, he would soon learn, would be the first brick laid. For the next few hours, Elias watched in stunned silence as people moved with purpose around the ruins of his home. He didn't ask them to come. He didn't know how to. Yet they arrived anyway, carrying boxes, gloves, trash bags, even hot food. It felt unreal, almost impossible. He had spent so much of his life believing he had to handle everything alone, that people were too busy, too distant, too wrapped up in their own problems to care about his. But here they were. At one point, he stood beside Daniel, both of them staring at the damaged foundation. "You don't have to do this," Elias murmured, guilt pressing against his ribs. Daniel shrugged lightly. "Sure we do. Life hits all of us in different ways. Today it hit you. Tomorrow maybe me." He paused, brushing ash from a shattered beam. A community isn't just people living near each other. It's people showing up when it counts. Those words sank deep into Elias's chest. Behind him, he heard soft laughter, not mocking, but warm. Some neighbors were sharing stories, trying to lighten the heaviness of the moment. Others were already discussing what could be rebuilt and how quickly. Then Mara approached, holding out a bag of food. "Eat," she insisted gently. "You won't make it through today on an empty stomach." He accepted it with trembling hands, not because he was hungry, but because he was overwhelmed by the kind of kindness he didn't think he deserved. "Why are you all doing this?" Elias finally asked again, voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived here for years, and I never really talked to anyone." Mara smiled softly, a smile that reached her eyes. "That's exactly why," she said. "Because you never asked for anything. Because you always kept to yourself. And because sometimes—" She glanced at the crowd behind her. "Sometimes the people who seem the most independent are the ones who need others the most." Elias swallowed hard. He turned away slightly, not wanting them to see the tears forming in his eyes. Not from sadness, but from the unexpected warmth building inside his chest. His gaze drifted across the street, where an elderly woman he'd only waved to in passing was organizing donated blankets. A teenager from 3 houses down swept debris aside with surprising determination. Even Mr. Patel, the stern man with the immaculate lawn, offered tools without hesitation. It was as if the fire had burned down the walls between him and the world, not just the walls of his house, but the ones around his heart. As the day wore on, Elias felt something changing in him, a slow, quiet shift, like a door opening to a room he didn't know he had inside. He wasn't used to receiving, wasn't used to leaning on anyone. But as the sun dipped lower and the cold returned, he finally allowed himself to say the words he had been holding back all morning. "Thank you," he whispered, voice shaking. "I don't know how to express what this means." Mara placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You don't have to say anything yet. Just let us stand with you. That's enough." And for the first time since the fire, Elias released a long, trembling breath, a breath that carried not only grief, but relief. Because the truth was finally settling in. He hadn't just lost something that night, he was also gaining something quiet, something rare, something priceless, and he was only beginning to understand it. By the second evening, the sky dimmed into a soft gray, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. Elias stood in front of what used to be his living space, feeling the familiar ache tighten in his chest. But now, that ache wasn't as sharp. It didn't hollow him out the way it did the night before, because he wasn't standing there alone. Mara was beside him, arms gently folded, her presence steady like a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. Daniel unloaded tools from his truck. A few neighbors talked softly as they sorted through the debris, separating what little could still be saved from what was beyond repair. It was strange, almost unbelievable, how something so devastating could become a place where people gathered not to mourn, but to lift. Elias knelt and picked up a small piece of charred wood. It crumbled in his hand like dust. "This was my dining table," he whispered. He remembered the countless nights he spent eating alone here, scrolling through his phone, thinking everyone else had someone, something, a life more meaningful than his. He had never imagined that one day he'd look at that same table, now just a pile of ash, and realize how wrong he'd been about what mattered. Behind him, footsteps approached again. This time it was Mr. Patel, his usually stoic neighbor with the quiet, tidy lawn. "I salvaged this from the back," he said, handing Elias a small metal box. It was under some collapsed beams, might be personal. Elias froze. The box was scorched, dented, nearly unrecognizable, but he knew exactly what it was. Inside were letters his mother wrote him before she passed away. Words he hadn't read in years because they were always there, tucked safely away, waiting. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letters were still intact. A small gasp left his throat, and the world around him blurred for a moment. He wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed, but Mr. Patel just nodded once and stepped away without saying more, offering respect in silence. Elias held the box close to his chest, feeling the weight of something that had survived the flames, something that reminded him of where he came from, and the love that had shaped him long before life became complicated. Mara knelt beside him. "You okay?" He nodded slowly, though emotion still surged through him. "It's strange," he whispered. "I thought I lost everything, but now, the things I needed most are still here." She smiled gently. "Sometimes it takes losing the surface of your life to reveal what's underneath." He looked around again, at the neighbors still working, at the small pile of belongings they'd saved, at the people who chose to stay instead of returning to the comfort of their homes. And suddenly, gratitude bloomed inside him so powerfully it almost hurt. Gratitude for the box in his hands, for the people who stood with him, for the reminder that even after devastation, something beautiful can remain. He ran a hand across his face and whispered, half to himself, "I never realized how much kindness surrounds me, until now." Mara placed a hand on his back. "You're not alone, Elias. You never were. You just couldn't see it." Something inside him cracked wide open, not from pain, but from recognition. The fire had taken his home, but it had also cleared away the fog he'd lived under for years. In the ruins, he found people. In the smoke, he found clarity. And in the ashes, he found gratitude. A new kind of gratitude, not for what he owned, but for who stood with him when he had nothing left. And that, he was starting to realize, was priceless. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Elias stepped outside Mara's house and walked toward the remains of his home. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke that still lingered from the fire. But something about the morning felt different, quieter, gentler, almost sacred. He stood at the edge of the charred foundation, taking in the sight without flinching this time. The wreckage was still there, the blackened beams, the collapsed roof, the ashes that clung stubbornly to the ground. But instead of despair, he felt a strange stillness inside him, a fragile, determined calm. He wasn't sure if it was strength, not yet, but it was something close. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. "You're up early." Mara's voice carried the warmth of someone who understood without needing to ask. "I needed to see it," he said, "to really see it, without fear." She stood beside him, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "And what do you see now?" Elias took a slow breath. "I see the truth," he whispered, "that the fire didn't just burn my house, it burned everything I hid behind. All the excuses, all the isolation, the belief that I had to go through life alone." His hands slid into his coat pockets as he continued. "Losing everything showed me what I still had, what I never paid attention to, and what I never said." Mara watched him quietly, waiting. He turned to her, voice low and sincere. "I'm grateful, not for the fire, but for the people it brought closer, for the ones who stayed, for you." She smiled softly, her eyes warming. "You don't need to thank me, Elias. We just did what anyone would do." But he shook his head gently. "No, not anyone. Not everyone shows up when everything falls apart." He gazed over the silent ruins again. "And I realized something," he continued. "Before I rebuild anything out here," he tapped his chest lightly, "I need to rebuild in here." Mara nodded as if she had hoped he'd reach that understanding on his own. "That's the real foundation," she said, "the one that lasts." A car door shut nearby, and they turned to see Daniel walking over with a rolled blueprint under his arm. "You two talking philosophy again?" he teased lightly. "Good. You'll need it. Rebuilding a house is mostly patience and stubborn hope." Elias managed a small laugh, a sound he hadn't heard from himself since the fire. Daniel unrolled the paper across the hood of his truck. "I sketched some possibilities," he said. "Just rough ideas. We can adjust anything. But the sooner we plan, the sooner we build." Elias looked at the lines, the outlines of walls and windows that didn't exist yet. A home that wasn't real, not yet, but could be. A home built not just by his hands, but by the hands of a community he once thought didn't see him. A home built on gratitude. He felt something inside him lift, a small, steady flame. "Let's do it," he said quietly. Daniel grinned. "That's the spirit." As the three of them stood together in the cold morning, plans spread out before them, Elias realized something profound. The fire had taken what was temporary, but the people around him were helping him rebuild what was lasting. Not walls, not furniture, not possessions, but connection, strength, faith in others, and in himself. And for the first time since the night of the fire, Elias felt a certainty rise in his chest. This wasn't just the rebuilding of a house, this was the rebuilding of a life. The days that followed unfolded in a slow yet steady rhythm. Not rushed, not frantic, but purposeful. Every morning, the cold air greeted Elias as he stood at the edge of the ruins, watching as neighbors trickled in one by one, bringing tools, coffee, spare materials, or simply their presence. It humbled him. Every single time. He wasn't used to this, to hands reaching out without being asked, to people caring without expecting anything in return. Yet here they were, showing up again and again. Daniel hammered stakes into the ground, measuring distances with a precision that made Elias smile. Mara organized volunteers, her voice calm and focused as she delegated tasks. Even the local hardware store owner dropped off donated supplies, leaving them with a simple message: everyone deserves a place to start again. Elias found himself working alongside people he had once only passed by in silence. They talked, laughed, shared stories, some light, some heavy, all real. And slowly, he felt himself changing. Not because he was rebuilding a structure, but because something inside him was being put back together brick by brick. One afternoon, while clearing debris from what used to be the front yard, Elias paused as he uncovered a half-burned wooden frame. Inside it was a picture, scorched at the edges but still clear enough to recognize. It was him, much younger, standing next to his mother, his breath caught in his throat. He brushed the soot gently with his thumb. Mara walked over, noticing the stillness in his posture. "What is it?" she asked softly. Elias held up the frame. "My mom," he whispered. "This picture. I thought it was gone forever." Mara smiled, touched. Some things survive the fire for a reason. He stared at the photo, at the young man he used to be, full of dreams and untouched by the heaviness that life later brought. He had forgotten that version of himself, forgotten the warmth, the hope, the light inside him. Maybe the fire wasn't just destruction. Maybe it was a reminder, a call to return to who he once was. He set the photo aside carefully, feeling a quiet promise forming inside him. Not to rebuild the old life, but to build a better one. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the volunteers slowly headed home, Elias stayed behind with Mara and Daniel to review the latest progress. They stood in the cool twilight, looking at the fresh foundation lines they had mapped out together. "It's starting to look real," Daniel said proudly. Mara nodded. "You're really doing this, Elias." He looked at both of them, their faces illuminated by the fading light, their hands dusted with soil and ash, their expressions filled with genuine care. "I couldn't do it alone," he admitted. "I wouldn't even know where to begin." Mara tapped his arm gently. "You're learning. Let people in, and there's nothing you can't rebuild." Elias exhaled slowly, feeling the truth of her words settle deeply in his chest. He thought back to the night of the fire, the fear, the loneliness, the overwhelming darkness. And then he looked at the present, the people, the support, the warmth. What had changed wasn't the world, it was him. His heart had shifted, opened, softened. In losing everything, he found something he didn't even know he was missing. Gratitude for the small moments, for the unexpected kindness, for the community he had overlooked, for the new beginning rising from the ashes. As they rolled up the blueprints and prepared to head home, Elias whispered to himself, not out of despair, but out of a newfound clarity. This is what truly matters. And with each passing day, he knew he was getting closer not just to rebuilding a house, but to rebuilding a life worth living. Winter crept deeper into the town, painting rooftops with frost and filling the air with the bite of cold mornings. Yet every day, without fail, people still showed up. Some brought sandwiches, some brought tools, some brought nothing but their time, and somehow, that felt like the greatest gift of all. Elias worked alongside them, learning how to measure beams, pour concrete, steady his hands on tasks he'd never done before. He made mistakes, plenty of them, but every time he stumbled, someone was there to help him up, guide his hands, or simply remind him that rebuilding was never meant to be perfect. One afternoon, as they prepared to raise the first wooden frame, the air hummed with anticipation. This moment, this first wall, felt symbolic, heavier than the physical structure itself. "Ready?" Daniel asked, placing his hands firmly on the beam. Elias swallowed hard and nodded. "Ready." But when the group lifted the frame together, something unexpected happened. A sound, a low, collective exhale, spread through everyone present, as if they were witnessing something sacred. It wasn't just a wall rising from the ashes, it was a declaration. Hope still stands here. Mara stood back, arms crossed, unable to hide her smile as she watched Elias guide the wall into place, his face filled with focus and quiet pride. When it was finally secured, Elias stepped back, wiping his forehead with the sleeve of his jacket. He stared at the newly raised structure, breath catching in his throat. "It's real," he whispered. He felt like a child seeing something miraculous for the first time. "It's actually happening." Mara stepped beside him, her voice soft. "You're rebuilding a home, Elias, but more than that, you're rebuilding yourself." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the moment to wash over him. The cold air, the warm hands that had helped him, the laughter echoing behind him as neighbors celebrated the milestone. And then, something inside him cracked open fully. The grief he'd carried was still there, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt honored, held, transformed. Later that evening, as the volunteers dispersed, one by one offering their goodbyes, Elias lingered near the frame they had just erected. He traced the wood with his fingertips, fresh, solid, new. He felt the same inside himself, a new foundation, a new sense of belonging, a new understanding of what made life truly meaningful. As he turned to head back to Mara's warm living room, he noticed a small, wrapped box sitting on the ground near the entrance of the site. Confused, he picked it up. Inside was a simple keychain, a small wooden carving of a house. No note, no signature, just the carving, carefully shaped, clearly handmade. Elias held it for a moment, his throat tightening. Someone had given him the symbol of a home, even before the house existed. He closed his hand around it, fingers trembling with emotion. Gratitude wasn't just something he felt now, It was something he carried, something that grew stronger each day, something that shaped how he saw the world. As he walked back under the early evening sky, the faint glow of streetlights guiding his path, Elias understood the truth he had been circling since the night everything burned. His old life had ended, but something far more precious had been revealed underneath the ashes. And what he was building now wasn't just a place to live, it was a place he finally belonged. Winter deepened, but the work continued. Slow, determined, and full of life. Every day brought progress measured not just in nails driven or boards lifted, but in the quiet shifts taking place inside Elias's heart. He found himself waking earlier, stepping into the cold with something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Not the kind you chase to impress anyone, but the kind that grows when you understand why you're still standing. One morning, as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, Elias stood alone before the skeleton of his soon-to-be home. He wrapped his fingers around the wooden house keychain he kept in his pocket, feeling the grooves carved into it. Who had made it? Who left it for him? Sometimes he wondered, but part of him liked not knowing. It felt like a gift from all of them, a symbol of something larger than any one person. He closed his eyes and whispered into the cold, "Thank you." He didn't have to say it loud. The gratitude lived in his breath, his steps, his growing strength. As he turned to begin the day's work, he noticed Mara approaching with 2 cups of hot tea. "You were out here early," she said, handing him one. He smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. This place, it doesn't feel like ruins anymore." "And what does it feel like now?" He gazed up at the rising frame, the snow resting gently on its beams. "Like a heartbeat," he said quietly. "Like something alive." Mara's eyes softened. "That's because of you, Elias. You've changed." He froze at her words. Changed? He didn't feel like he had done anything extraordinary. He had simply shown up, mostly because others showed up first. But Mara saw something he didn't. "You let people in," she continued. "You let yourself need others, and that takes more strength than most people know." He stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You know," he said, "I used to think gratitude was something you said at the dinner table, something polite, something expected." "And now?" she asked. He looked at his hands, roughened from work, warmed by countless small acts of kindness. "Now I think gratitude is what keeps you standing when everything else burns." Mara smiled, not a bright smile, but a deep, knowing one. A smile that said, "You understand now." Before she could respond, Daniel's familiar shout echoed from down the road. "You two planning to work today or just philosophize until spring?" Mara laughed. Elias actually laughed with her, a sound free of heaviness for the first time in weeks. As the day unfolded, neighbors drifted in again. The house continued to rise, piece by piece, as snowflakes melted against warm, working hands. And though Elias hammered nails and lifted beams, his mind kept returning to a single thought, something he had been circling since the morning. What the fire took was never the source of his life. The fire had revealed something hidden, something he had never learned to see until everything around him collapsed. By the time the sun dipped low, a soft orange glow warming the snow-covered yard, Elias stood before the newly built framework of what would soon become his living room. He imagined it filled, not with things, but with people. Warmth, laughter, presence. For the first time since he lost everything, he whispered a new truth to himself. Maybe this is the life I was meant to live all along. A life built not from possessions, but from connection, from community, from the kind of gratitude that survives even the fiercest flames. And he knew, with a certainty that felt solid as the beams now rising before him, that the greatest thing the fire had given him was a second chance to see what truly matters. Snow fell softly the next morning, blanketing the unfinished house in quiet white. Elias arrived before anyone else, brushing frost off the wooden beams, breathing warm air into his cold hands. But today, something felt different. A calmness, a clarity, as if the world had paused just to listen. He walked toward the old mailbox, the one that somehow survived the fire, intending to check if the hinges had frozen again. But when he opened it, there was an envelope, a simple, unmarked envelope, just like the first one. His breath caught. For a moment he simply stared, the cold forgotten. Then, with a trembling hand, he slid the letter out. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was the same, gentle, steady, familiar in its quiet strength. It read, "Elias, some fires destroy, others reveal. This one showed you what you had forgotten. You are not alone. You never were." Elias swallowed hard. His eyes moved to the next lines. "You think this house stands because people cared about you, and they did. But it also stands because you chose to keep going, even when you couldn't see any reason to." He closed his eyes as emotion pulled at his chest. Courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's the shaky step. Sometimes it's the small yes on the days you want to give up. Sometimes it's letting others help you carry what's too heavy alone. Elias wiped a tear that had begun to slip down his cheek. And then came the final paragraph, the one that made his breath stop. "When your home is finished, leave this letter inside its walls so that it becomes part of the place you rebuild. A reminder that even in ashes, hope can take root again." At the bottom, just like before, was no name, no signature, just a single, simple line. "You're stronger than the fire." Elias stood frozen, the letter trembling in his hands as snowflakes drifted through the silent morning. He didn't know who wrote it. He didn't need to, because this wasn't from a single person. It felt like a voice made from all of them, the town, the helpers, the friends he never realized he had. A voice reminding him of the truth he had denied for too long. He was never fighting alone. A crunch of footsteps approached from behind. Daniel's voice broke the silence, gentle this time. "You okay there, Eli?" Elias turned, eyes shining but calm. "Yeah," he said. "I just got another letter." Mara stepped close, eyes wide. "Another one? What does it say?" Elias looked back at the house, half-built, snow-dusted, hopeful, and folded the letter carefully. "It says," he replied softly, "that some things are meant to be rebuilt, stronger than before." He walked to the nearest wall frame, slid the letter between two wooden beams, and pressed it gently into place. Mara watched with a tender smile. Daniel placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, and for the first time since the fire, Elias didn't feel the weight of loss. He felt the weight of purpose. The house rose slowly in the weeks that followed, full of laughter, footsteps, shared meals, borrowed tools, stories told around bonfires, and the warmth of people coming together. When it was finally finished, Elias stood inside his new home, sunlight pouring through the windows. The walls were fresh, the paint new, the air warm. But what made the house feel alive wasn't anything he could see. It was what was hidden within the walls. A letter, a symbol, a reminder, a seed of hope planted in wood and memory. He placed his hand on the wall, right where he had tucked it between the beams, and he whispered, with gratitude deeper than words, "Thank you, whoever you are." Outside, life moved gently. Inside, a heart finally healed. Because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones that rescue us, but the ones that remind us why we're worth rescuing.
Thank you for spending your time listening to the entire story I shared. See you in the next video. If you find it helpful or enjoyable, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much.